Please hold your applause. Thank you, Shannon. Now, in preparation for today's discussion, I did a bit of research myself because it's helpful for me to know a little more than the people I'm talking to, and I'm hopeful that that is the case. One of the things that I ran across was the financial management of cyber risk. It's available over the internet, downloaded free of charge, licensed to me. I will make it available to you if you'd like it. At any rate, I learned a new term about myself that I hadn't heard myself referred to in this way, and I thought I'd read this because I think it might represent some of others in this room. The fact is that the current private sector workplace, most of whom will remain working for decades to come, is largely uneducated about cyber security. For the most part, the people in this group, especially senior executives, are what demographers are now calling digital immigrants. Have you ever heard that term? Digital immigrants. And this means that they were not born into today's digital world, and they may face, quote, language barriers when it comes to the rhetoric of information security. Does this sound like something that might be associated with your particular companies? I believe it is. No offense to Mr. Kerr and Mr. Cruikshanker in the room, the senior executives, because I find them, by the way, to be much more sophisticated and knowledgeable and speaking the language of information security than most. And it's largely because of some of the leading edge work that we're doing in terms of managing data for our clients in the Wellness Initiative, because it does give us access to a very powerful data. And because of that, and because of HIPAA, we have been forced, if not inclined to anyway, understand how to protect that data. It's extremely important to us and to the clients that we serve. So I think that's certainly a good thing. So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the underwriting requirements, because that's a segue from what Shannon was talking about. How do we ensure cyber risk? Initially called cyber liability, but as she pointed out, it's now cyber liability and also first party. But these are the kind of things that underwriters look for in order to evaluate a particular company and whether or not they're a good risk from the cyber standpoint. And these are pretty basic information. The most important of which, though, are the fourth, risk management questions. And this helps them try and get a handle on how sophisticated is this particular company in managing the risk to cyber. And are you in compliance with regulations, of course. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this particular slide. The main focus of what I'm going to talk about is cyber risk management. Now, in this report I mentioned, the financial aspects of cyber risk, one of the things that they did in the executive summary, which I found very compelling, is that business is currently on the front lines of a raging cyber war that is costing trillions of dollars and endangering our national security. I don't think they've overstated that at all, in fact. I think that's absolutely true. Effective low-cost mechanisms are already in place to shield against many elements of cyber threat. But too often, executive leaders wait until they are compromised to put a reactive plan into action, damaging their company's reputation and incurring additional cost. So, greater understanding is absolutely needed, and a framework for addressing cyber risk is something that we have to do. And one of the things that's so unique about cyber risk is that it's exploding. It's absolutely morphing every second of every day. And so how do you keep up with something that's changing so rapidly? And so you have to do it in a very planned way and a good framework. So what really is at risk for every company in terms of cyber risk? It's your brand. That's the number one risk. Your reputation and the trust of your customers, because if you don't have that, you're not going to be in business very long, I would imagine. So that's the number one risk that every organization faces when they're trying to address this whole cyber risk area. Now, risk management It's been around for a number of years, and these are some of the basics of it. I'm not going to read that because it's pretty understood by most organizations, but it's basically trying what can happen, how bad could it be if it does happen, and what can we do to keep it from happening and mitigate it if it does happen. A comprehensive risk management approach is what's needed, and that's been referred to in many organizations as enterprise risk management. You've heard that term, it's used quite often. So, cyber risk assessments. Who are you going to call? Does anybody remember Ghostbusters? I was going to have that theme played, but they decided not to do that. At any rate, who are you going to call? The Ghostbusters. And I think Ghostbusters is kind of a good analogy because so much of cyber is kind of ghostly. It's so unknown. It's those things that are operating in the ether, and you can't see them, but you know they're there, and they can hurt you. So most insurance policies, as Shannon mentioned, offer some level of protection. The first level of protection, by the way, is the application that you have to complete, which is quite extensive. And it can challenge some of the IT people in terms of responding. And just by asking questions, it begs certain answers. And if you don't have the right answers, you might be denied coverage, first of all. But secondly, it suggests that maybe there are things that you can be doing and should be doing to make yourself a better risk. So that's the first thing. But there are basic levels of risk assessment, and they are offered through most of the insurance carriers. Shannon would know exactly whether all companies do, but I do have a number of them. Net Diligence is the provider that I'm most familiar with that many carriers, as you see up here, are partnered with. And they build into the insurance product, I believe, as much as 2 hours of online, not face-to-face, not on your site, but a 2-hour assessment, if you will, of whether or not you are protected to any great extent. And then they can also offer a lot more extensive assessment, including coming out and spending 2 or 3 days or however long it's necessary for your particular organization to assess your overall risk to cyber and data breaches. So these are some of the key partners and some of the carriers. I think there's probably others I'm sure Shannon would be aware of, but those are ones that are most recognizable, I think. So the key issues to consider, and there's nothing here that you would not be familiar with, and I believe even Shannon may have touched on a number of them: physical and environmental security. The number one issue is personal security, personnel security, and I'm going to get into more about that a little later. These are the things that must be considered in making sure that you are properly managing cyber risk for your organization. And one of the things about cyber risk management is that we know what to do. That's a good thing. The problem is we're really not doing it, and we're not doing it as fast or as often or as regularly as we should. That's the problem, particularly with cyber because of, as I say, that morphing quality. A lot of the other kinds of insurance areas and coverages that we have aren't changing as rapidly as cyber. So these are some of the things that Shannon, I think, addressed and was kind enough to provide me with as part of this presentation. These are fundamental. These are basic. They are necessary, but they're not sufficient. They're not enough. So we have to do more and better and faster and deeper and broader and wider. I think I've used all the adjectives I can think of. Okay. So the biggest threat that we have to cyber risk is not understanding how explosive it is and what we need to do. So it is enterprise-wide, and one of the things that we run across so often when we're looking at a company in terms of the cyber risk is the silo effect. There are very few organizations that aren't operating in silos. And one of the reasons is they have people who are very good and knowledgeable in doing whatever that particular function within the organization is. And so they kind of just do it. And they operate somewhat independently, separately from the rest of the organization. And because of this, they may not be talking to each other when they should be, because cross-departmental issues do arise, particularly with cyber risk. So we really do need to have a cross-departmental integrated approach. And everyone needs to understand the economic value and importance of managing cyber and data. But the biggest single organizational vulnerability is people. People. That's the number one. Another quote from this Financial Management of Cyber Risk: far too often in the IT security discipline, this process is solely focused on vulnerability. What is the vulnerability that needs to be mitigated or eliminated? That's the focus. The reality is that there are many and that they constantly morph. So then how should the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information and systems be ensured? The simple answer is a holistic risk management process that constantly improves the layered defenses of an organization. So constant improvement, regular attention to this subject is really what's needed by every organization. And I think we're starting to realize how important this is. I know that the partners group is, because I spoke to our IT people in preparation for today. I thought I should at least find out what kind of security we have, and I'm pleased to report that our security is much better than it was, which could be interpreted a number of ways, of course. But it is improving, and we are diligent. This Heartbleed, everyone's familiar, I think, with the press reports. Heartbleed, used by hackers in big attack. Has everybody heard about Heartbleed? Okay. Have your companies done anything about Heartbleed? Anybody? Anything that you know of that has been done? We have. We immediately had to go through a re-password, and there was a number of things that our IT people told us we had to do that some people didn't enjoy doing, but it was very important. It was very critical, and Heartbleed was something, I mean, who would have thought? The internet, my goodness. So we must have that kind of diligence in every aspect of our cybersecurity. So, from this treatise that I told you about, there was a 6-step approach to cyber risk management. And I'm going to go through these in detail on the remaining slides. So I'm just going to have you look at them, see what they are. So, let's getting started. Owning the problem. One of the biggest problems associated with addressing any kind of problem or issue within an organization is making sure that we are funding it properly. And that rarely happens. And I think we're seeing improvements in the funding of it. We also believe that in order to make these things work, that cross-departmental authority, that means the C-suite, those people who have the overarching view of the organization need to work to help break down some of the silos, or at least help them communicate and collaborate where it comes to cyber risk. And it must be on a strategic basis, which is another reason the C-suite is involved. Technology now has come to be appreciated by most organizations as being a driving part of almost every strategy. It's so key in terms of inventory management, to how you deal with your customers and how you relate to your customers and how you store lots of their data. The second step that needs to have happen is appointing a cyber risk team. So I asked our IT fellow, do we have a cyber risk team? So well, we have an IT department. Every organization nowadays has an IT department, but they're talking here about something much broader than the IT department. Now, we have an exceptional IT department, and they are an integral part of this cyber risk team. This team will need to be made up by functional areas within the organization that are not IT specialists, but will collaborate with those IT professionals, and they're going to get input from all of the stakeholders, customers, vendors, other workers, other departments. These are the things that the team will be doing in order to inform the organization about what must be done in order to protect this organization from cyber risk. They need to meet regularly. And this ideally should be done face-to-face, which is problematic for many organizations, multi-locations, but now we have lots of capabilities in terms of video conferencing. But the face-to-face is particularly useful because there's a lot of things that you can see when you're meeting with somebody, and it helps in the communication. So meeting regularly, a key part of cyber risk management. Developing the risk management plan across all departments, again, breaking down the silos so that all of these functional areas can be allocated and that there are roles and actions to be taken regularly to protect the data. Communicating and collaborating is so important among the cross departments. Awareness. I think we talked about people being the number one issue associated with cyber risk, and certainly increasing employee awareness. And again, not IT so much as everybody else, the people who are actually doing the work. And addressing all of the data categorization, retention, and how we are going to respond. So developing this plan across all departments and making sure it's communicated and in a formal plan. Not just how to respond, but how to recover from a data breach. The budget. How do you calculate the cost? These three things, the threat, the vulnerability, the consequence, all three multiplied together will determine the gross financial risk of the organization. You subtract from that the risk transfer that Shannon talked about, the insurance product, you come up with the net financial risk. But that's important because then you can determine economically, you can quantify the cost and potential cost to the organization, and then you'll know how much you should spend. And by the way, some of the budgeting, 5 to 6% of the IT infrastructure budget has been suggested. 1.5% of an enterprise's total revenue. That may shock some of you. That's a big number, but it's important because this is a big deal. There is a lot to do, and it costs a lot to do it. So best practices companies spend 30% more than the average. Best practice companies, and that's what you want to be when it comes to cyber risk management. Final thing is making sure that you actually do all of these things. It's important to know what to do, but it's even more important to actually do what you need to do. So 60% of incidents, you already had the stuff in place to prevent, but did not follow them. So implementing and analyzing and testing, so important, and making sure you have metrics, because you cannot manage something if you can't measure it. So measurement is so important, and doing audits. I tell a very brief little story of this company that's very proud of their data security. In fact, that's what they did for a living. They provided a data service to their customers, and they thought they were state of the art. So they hired a company to come in and test them. And a fellow who was trying to get hired as a consultant on security was allowed to participate in this. And so he watched on a video with the physical security people and the IT people on a particular day when this test was going to occur by this organization hired to penetrate their defenses. And they were pretty sure nothing was going to happen. In fact, they even brought beer and had pizza, and they were going to watch the cameras and watch them fail at this. And what they found on the video camera, they were watching it, they saw a homeless fellow, and he was in people's face, basically, as they were coming and going from the facility. And they were watching him, and they thought that was odd, but they saw him, and he was there and doing all that. Now, just to get a little ahead here, he was actually hired by them, and he was getting their card access information surreptitiously by pretending to be a homeless person and by being so intrusive that he was able to do this. Then there was also a very well-dressed person who came up to one of the doors, and he was filling his Starbucks cup. He had a McDonald's bag, and he had some other things that he was managing, and he was putting them down, and he was in front of the door as he was doing this, and he was spending several minutes doing that. And to get ahead again, what he was doing was called impressioning. And he was also finding a way to use the data from the homeless person. And so the two of them then were off screen, and they left like at 1:15 in the afternoon. And they figured it would be a while before they came back. 1:20 they were back. And the well-dressed, just the well-dressed man, not the homeless person, he was gone. He was done. So the well-dressed person came in, put in a key, and went in the front door. So that was the first breach. Right now, it was immediate. It was done. Because the homeless person, pretending to be, had provided the data necessary to get through the first door. So then there was a second set of security, which he took the McDonald's bag, put it in front of the scanner, light turned green, and he walked in. Go figure. But they knew how to do it, and they got in. So they only had one more door to go through to get to over $200 million worth of computer server data and everything. Put the McDonald's bag up, stayed red. So they were watching this fellow. He took his smartphone, put a light under the door, and then he did something quite unusual. He urinated under the door. And the movement or the weight of that triggered the opening mechanism, and he got in. He walked in, called his boss, says, "We're in." Now, that's a pretty novel approach. The hackers are smarter than we are. I'm sorry, they are. So we've got to stay ahead of them. Now, that's a shocking example of how you can actually be breached. It can happen. So we must analyze, test, and feedback, and use audits. And we also need to review our plan regularly and make sure that our budget is adequate and in staying in touch with what needs to be done. Focusing on the basics, too. And we can get caught up in Heartbleed and all these others, but focusing on the basics, because most of them are pretty basic risks. We hope this has been helpful and a good start, because that's all it is just the beginning.
Yeah.
So when you ask the question, who are you going to call? I hope you call Partners Group, because we're your access point to Brown and Writing and Shannon. So thank you again for being here, and please, we'll stay around if you have additional questions. Thank you.
Thanks.